World War II is in full swing. The Germans only have one shot, one opportunity to stop the Allied offensive, the onslaught of American power and might. But will they capture it, or just let it slip? Germany's attempt to prevent the Allies from taking all of Germany will lead to the bloodiest and largest battle on the Western Front of all of World War II. It's a battle of the Bulge. Let's get ready for it. At this point of World War II, the Americans and the Allies have been having near victory after victory, despite some setbacks in Market Garden, as well as in the slog that was the Battle of Aachen, which is commonly known as America's Stalingrad. The United States, as well as the Western Allies, were just moving straight forward through, right into the heart of Germany. Hitler and his generals only had a few options to try and prevent this total annihilation of the German war machine. Hitler and a few other of his generals didn't want to accept the fact that they would lose the war. What they were hoping is to be able to make a giant push and then be able to sue for peace. Some more reasonable generals were hoping just to be able to halt the Western Allies' advance long enough so they could move east and take on the Soviets, and hopefully be able to prevent what was the eventual outcome of American troops walking through Germany. But we're hoping for something more of World War I, where there wasn't a full, total victory that was seen by every German citizen. As they were going through their different options, they saw a few different. There was Italy. The Italy campaign had somewhat stalled. Because of Italy's high mountains and deep passes, it was hard for the Americans to push deeper and deeper into Italy and make it to Germany through that route, especially with a big neutral Switzerland in the way. Because of this, Hitler really didn't see much of a point in pouring more resources into it since it was already mostly halted. Now on the Eastern Front, it was going back and forth, but there wasn't anywhere that he could make a big decisive blow to prevent the Soviets' continual march forward, which just left the Western Front. There's a few different possibilities. So the Nazi generals needed to figure out what the real plan was. Some of the ones who really actually knew that the war was lost and all they could hope for was as least amount of dead as possible, they were called defeatists, and defeatism was illegal in Germany, so those guys all kept their mouths shut. So where were the Germans going to hit? They had some different options up north, some a little bit further south. However, right down the middle, right where the Western War really started, Ardennes Forest. In the Ardennes Forest, that's where the Nazis initially launched their campaign into France. That's where the French did not see them coming. They thought they were going to go through Belgium, as they had been feinting towards at the beginning of the war. However, because of their massive blow through the Ardennes Forest, and they were able to separate the French and the British, pushing the French all the way back to Dunkirk, they were hoping to do a similar thing to the Americans and the British in this situation. As part of their attack and their thrust into the Allied lines, they were hoping to make it to the port of Antwerp and be able to cut off the British and American forces. The different things that were helping the Germans with this. First off, the Allies had been advancing so quickly that a lot of their veteran soldiers were completely worn out and needed a break. As well, because of the rapid advance, supplies were running desperately low at the front. Whether it was winter coats, whether it was medical supplies or ammunition, having to get it all the way from Cherbourg, from the port of Antwerp, or from the beaches, it was still taking a really long time to get up there. Coupled with this, the soldiers on the American side that were in the Ardennes Forest were newer recruits that hadn't been battle hardened. Many of them were there to try and get their first experience at combat so that they could learn how to be on the front, how to operate while being fired upon, before being moved into a much deadlier position. Because the Americans had been pushing so hard, they really didn't see an offensive coming from Germany. They figured that they were already on the back foot. As they were pushing through different areas, they didn't want to go through the Ardennes because it had very small roads, it had all the different problems that the French and the British assumed in the first place would prevent the Germans from launching an offensive. They saw this dark, deep dark forest that was full of trees, and they just figured that's not a great place to try and do an offensive. This is how the Nazis had their advantage. They were able to amass their forces. Because of cloud cover, they were able to amass massive amounts of forces without the Allies knowing. In the beginning, there was only a few 100,000 American, whereas there was well over 400,000 German troops. As part of the German offensive, they were hoping that if they could actually strike into Antwerp and separate the Allies would just try and pursue a peaceful solution, ending the Western Allies' portion of the war and allowing the Germans to fully focus on the Eastern Front, which was their only option in actually being able to fully defeat one side or the other. By striking in the dead of winter right before Christmas, they caught the Americans completely unawares. If you're ever in the military and it's about to be a holiday, think there's probably going to be a big attack, because that's always what happens, whether it's in the Vietnam War, whether it's in World War II. Christmas, New Year's, any special holiday, that's when the enemy attacks. But the Americans did not see this coming. Because of that, Germans were able to move in a lot of armored divisions as well as infantry. And the Allies had been controlling the skies for so long, they really didn't expect there to be any big mass ground movements. The Allies had basically been controlling the air since before D-Day. And now, more than ever, they had total air superiority. The Luftwaffe had barely even been seen. This was also going to play towards the hubris that would affect the Allies when it came to the air campaign. As many battle-hardened American soldiers had been fighting all the way since Normandy, many of them were moved to slower parts of the front or preparing for their next big offensive. Because of all these issues, this would be the third deadliest campaign in U.S. history, as well as part of it would be the deadliest battle in U.S. history, Battle of Elsenburn Ridge, where over 5,000 American men would die. So that's the lead up to December 6th, 1944. The Germans preparing their attack, getting ready, while the Americans preparing for a cold night's sleep. Then all of a sudden the German troops burst forward, armored divisions, 90-minute barrage coming down on American forces, using over 1,600 pieces of German artillery. The German armored troops smashed through American lines, pushing deep within, letting infantry to clean up the rest. Many of these American troops fought bravely, but because of the overwhelming force of nearly double their size, they could not withstand many of the onslaught. Starting from the north, the Battle of Elsenburn Ridge was the deadliest battle in U.S. history. Those soldiers up there were a little bit more battle-hardened, and many of the ones in the 99th, they were completely inexperienced, but they held firm, and they were able to fight off the German attack. While the Siege of Bastogne often gets quite a lot of the attention when it comes to the Battle of the Bulge, because these men were able to fight off and hold off that attack in Elsenburn, they were actually the major component in preventing them from being able to take Antwerp and separating the Allies. Many of the German soldiers who were constantly attacking the ridge had to be rerouted into the open pocket, had less useful roads, and had to be rerouted, and it would take much longer. When you're trying to stop an enemy advance, the biggest thing is just slowing it down for your American allies to come in behind you. By them being able to hold that line, and many of the Americans throughout the line holding it as hard as they could, that gave the Americans time to fall in behind and stop an open gushing wound of Germans. As the German soldiers were pushing inward, many of these soldiers were SS. If you know anything about World War II, these are the worst of the worst, the evil of the evilest. They were the ones perpetrating many of the war crimes, and their countless war crimes were perpetrated there. Battle of the Bulge as well. Many of these soldiers had previously been on Eastern Front, where wholesale slaughter of POWs was completely allowable. Well, these same guys brought the same kind of demonic attention to the Western Front. And when the Americans heard that they were slaughtering POWs, that let loose the dogs of war, and many of them refused to surrender because they assumed that they would be killed. This also made them want to get vengeance on their enemy to avenge the fallen. Meanwhile, further down south, the Germans gained more of an advantage. In the center of this assault, they were going for the town of St. Vith. This was a critical road junction that if the Americans could hold this long enough, it would really slow down the German war effort. The Americans there fought incredibly bravely, and even though they were vastly outnumbered, they were able to hold out for over a week, dramatically lowering the ability for the Germans to actually be able to make it into the American lines. This delaying action was able to blunt it long enough that the Americans were able to bring people in and staunch the bleeding. While all of this was happening, Allies were blowing bridges, taking different areas, and taking critical junctions to prevent them from being able to move further inward. A little bit further south, the Germans were able to push all the way into Selles and Marche. Because of these slowing actions of the American defenders, they were able to have people there to stop them from going any further. Because of quick Allied thinking, they were able to move people constantly through. One of these brave men that was able to get there before the Germans could move any further was my grandfather. He was part of the 7th Corps, and he had been fighting since D-Day +6, landing at Utah Beach and working his way inward at almost every major battle since then. In his journals, he said that he barely had a day of rest. It took months before he even got a shower. And so by this point, him and his men were battle-hardened and ready. Right before this battle, he was over in the Battle of Hertzgen Forest, which was a horrible battle that at some point I'll cover. When the orders came in, him and his men went on a long march to Marche. From there, him and his men helped push the Germans all the way back to Havlis. He was part of the jigsaw wire section of the 188th Field Artillery Group. They would run from the front lines back to the artillery, running wires and fixing them along the way. In his journals, he talked about how cold it was, repairing the lines, avoiding sniper fire, and going day and night trying not to get hit by the enemy artillery that were there to shred the lines. This was some of the hardest fighting of the war. And this man was from Montana, and if a Montana boy says it was cold, it was cold. Know anything about those northern states? We just wander around with t-shirts and shorts on and don't care if it's 10 degrees outside. So if he said it's cold, Dang, it was cold. As all of this was happening, a little further south, the Germans were moving towards Bastogne. Bastogne was a vastly important town within the region. It had 7 roads intersecting in Bastogne. So if the Germans could get there, they could go anywhere. Eventually, the Germans did surround all of Bastogne, but they wanted that because they could move the fastest through it. Don't let the Germans win. Concentrate fire on the subscribe button. And to oppose them is famously the 101st Airborne. If you've seen Band of Brothers, you recognize these guys. They were rushed in without winter clothing, without much needed supplies, into the pocket before it closed. And they had one order: hold that junction. If for some reason you haven't watched the Band of Brothers series or read the book, which might even be better, go check that out because it's incredible. Easy Company of the 506th did not have an easy time in Bastogne, but they stood fast against the German onslaught, didn't give up. Even when the German commander sent them a message telling them to surrender, Brigadier General McAuliffe replied, "Nuts," showing the stubborn resolve of the Americans to fight on till victory or death. Meanwhile, as all of this is happening, the Luftwaffe is attacking different bases in the north. The Luftwaffe didn't want to get left out of this. Because of the long, drawn-out air war that had been waging for years in Europe, many of the experienced aces of the German side had already been taken out. So many of these pilots were very inexperienced, and when they came in over American anti-aircraft fire, they didn't duck and weave. They didn't try and move out of the way. When American fighter pilots came in, they weren't able to be good enough to avoid them. The Luftwaffe, this was really their last ride. After this, they were almost completely decimated, while German armor pushed further and further into the American lines. Meanwhile, from the deep south, the Americans were able to hold the line down there, and General Patton pushed his way up, moving north. General Montgomery of the British was in charge of all the northern allies, and he was pushing down south. Patton would relieve the 101st, or in their words, they didn't need saving at all, but he went and helped them, and then he moved on up to Hofliz, as well as Montgomery moving in from the north. They met together there and then pushed further east and got rid of the Bulge. This massive German attack failed. While it did bring massive amounts of American casualties, it also completely obliterated their armored divisions as well as the Luftwaffe. Because of this, they had no ability to produce more tanks or more planes at any kind of level sufficient to continue on fighting at the same level they previously had been. It also lost tens of thousands of German soldiers. Within only 4 months of this battle ending, Allies would claim victory in Europe and set their sights on the Pacific. While Ally losses were extremely high, they weren't so high that the Allies couldn't handle it. There were nearly 90,000 American casualties. 19,000 of them were dead. The British played a small part in this battle. About 1,400 of their soldiers were casualties, with only about 200 of them dead. There's many reasons for this. Part of it was Montgomery was extremely cautious. He didn't want to send in British soldiers when American soldiers would do, and he was very slow to be able to mobilize them. However, the British did play a part, and we shouldn't forget that. That's something overlooked oftentimes in American documentaries, the British Empire's role in World War II. However, I've also seen on the opposite side the British documentaries, which barely talk about the Americans at all. At the height of the battle, there were over 700,000 American troops engaged in fighting. So considering the fact that 90,000 of them were casualties, you can really see how bloody this battle was. Because of the dramatic shortage in troops, Eisenhower for the first time integrated the military, allowing for black and white troops to fight alongside each other. This was one step closer to equality among American troops. On the German side, the battle is known as Operation Watch on the Rhine. Americans soon called this battle the Battle of the Bulge because of this salient in the American lines. The Battle of the Bulge was horrible fighting. However, it was truly one of the last gasps of the National Socialist Germans trying to take over Europe. Thank you so much for watching. Subscribe for more and check out these videos. Don't let the Germans win. Fire at will at the subscribe button.